In the quiet moments before dawn, Sophia Mitchell stood before her mirror, adjusting the graduation cap that seemed to weigh more heavily on her shoulders than it should. The morning light barely filtered through her bedroom window, casting soft shadows across the ceremonial gown that marked what should have been one of the proudest days of her life. But for Sophia, each second ticking closer to the ceremony brought another wave of anxiety. Being Sylvester Stallone's daughter had never been easy, but today that reality felt particularly overwhelming. The whispers had followed her through every hallway, every classroom, every achievement. She's only here because of her father. Everything's handed to her on a silver platter. She'll never know what it's like to really work for anything. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her father, the man who had written and starred in Rocky, a story about an underdog fighting against all odds, had inadvertently cast his own daughter in a role she never wanted. The privileged kid who had it all. But they didn't know about the late nights studying until her eyes burned, the extra hours she put in at the library, or the tears she'd shed trying to prove she was more than just a famous last name. Sophia's fingers traced the edge of her graduation gown, remembering the conversation she'd had with her father the night before. "Dad, maybe it's better if you don't come," she had suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "The press will be there, and I don't want to turn my graduation into a media circus." The hurt in his eyes had been visible even through the phone screen, but he had nodded, understanding as always. The drive to the university was a blur of early morning traffic and nervous energy. Sophia arrived early, finding her place among the sea of graduates. Isabella Green, her closest friend throughout college, gave her a reassuring squeeze of the hand. "You've earned this," she whispered, but Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that today would be just another reminder of how different her life was. As the ceremony began, the sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth touching the faces of proud parents and excited graduates. The university president, William Anderson, took to the podium, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd with practiced ease. "Today, we celebrate not just the completion of a journey, but the beginning of many others." Sophia tried to focus on his words, but her attention kept drifting to the crowd. Somewhere out there, her mother sat watching, probably wishing, as Sophia did, that things could be different. The empty seat beside her seemed to echo the void Sophia felt in her chest. The names began to be called. Alexander Hall followed by enthusiastic applause. Emma Carter, accompanied by cheerful whoops from her family. Each name brought its own celebration, its own moment of pure joy, unmarred by whispers or expectations. As Michael Nelson walked across the stage, Sophia felt her heart begin to race. She would be next. The weight of her name, both a blessing and a burden, seemed to press down on her shoulders. She could already hear the murmurs starting, could feel the phones being raised to capture the moment when Sylvester Stallone's daughter accepted her diploma. "Sophia Mitchell," the announcer called, his voice clear and professional. She rose on shaky legs, willing herself to walk with the dignity her father had always taught her to maintain. The first steps toward the stage felt like walking through deep water, each movement requiring conscious effort. The whispers began exactly as she'd feared. "That's Stallone's kid," someone said, not quite quietly enough. "Wonder if Daddy bought her grades too," another voice added, the words cutting through the polite applause like shards of glass. Sophia felt her cheeks burning as she approached the university president. This was supposed to be her moment. The culmination of 4 years of hard work, of proving herself, of trying to be more than just someone's daughter. But even now, even here, she couldn't escape the shadow of her father's fame. Then something changed. A commotion near the back of the crowd drew attention away from her. Sophia couldn't see what was happening, but she could feel the shift in the audience's energy. The whispers took on a different tone, excited rather than malicious. As she reached for her diploma, a familiar voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "That's my daughter." The words weren't shouted, but they carried with the same strength that had made Adrian famous decades ago. Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes searching the crowd. There, making his way down the center aisle, was Sylvester Stallone. But he wasn't wearing his usual designer suits or Hollywood attire. Instead, he was dressed in a simple gray sweatshirt and track pants, the outfit of Rocky Balboa, the character that had made him famous, the underdog who never gave up. The crowd's reaction was immediate, but it wasn't the usual celebrity frenzy Sophia had grown up dreading. Instead, there was something different in the air, something she hadn't expected. Her father wasn't walking in as a movie star. He was walking in as Rocky, the symbol of perseverance, of fighting against the odds, of earning every step forward. "I've watched my daughter fight harder than any opponent I've ever faced in the ring." His voice carried across the suddenly silent gathering. "She didn't want me here today because she didn't want to take attention away from her classmates. That's the kind of person she is, always thinking of others first." Sophia stood frozen on the stage, diploma halfway between her hand and the university president's. Her father continued walking forward, his familiar gait bringing him closer to the stage. "But you know what? Sometimes the biggest fights aren't the ones we face in the ring. Sometimes they're the ones we face every day, trying to prove ourselves, trying to be seen for who we are, not who people think we should be." The whispers had stopped completely now. Every eye was fixed on the scene unfolding before them. "My daughter didn't just graduate today," Stallone continued, now standing at the foot of the stage. "She graduated with honors, working 2 jobs, never missing a class, never asking for special treatment. She did it all on her own, and I couldn't be prouder." Tears were streaming down Sophia's face now, but she didn't care. Years of trying to maintain the perfect composure, of trying to prove she was worthy of her own achievements, seemed to melt away in the face of her father's words. "You see, the real Rocky story isn't about winning fights," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about getting up when life knocks you down. It's about facing your challenges head-on, even when it would be easier to give up. And that's exactly what my daughter has done, every single day of her college career." William Anderson, the university president, stepped back from the podium, understanding that this moment was about something more than just handing out a diploma. Sophia finally found her voice. "Dad," she managed to say, "you said you wouldn't come." "Yeah, well," he smiled, climbing the steps to the stage. "Rocky never was very good at following the rules." The laughter that rippled through the crowd was warm, genuine, free from any trace of the earlier judgment. As Sylvester Stallone wrapped his arms around his daughter, the applause began. It started slowly, a few claps here and there, but it quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. This wasn't applause for a celebrity or his famous daughter. This was applause for a father and daughter, for hard work, for perseverance, for love that transcends fame and fortune. In that moment, surrounded by the cheers of her classmates and their families, Sophia realized something profound. The name she had sometimes seen as a burden was actually a testament to everything her father had taught her, about working hard, about never giving up, about being true to yourself no matter what others might say. The university president finally stepped forward again, handing Sophia her diploma with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect. "You've more than earned this." As Sophia walked off the stage, her father's arm still around. Her shoulders, she could hear the conversation around her, had changed. "Did you know she worked 2 jobs? I had no idea she never asked for special treatment. That's what real strength looks like. Isabella Green was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, tears in her eyes and a huge smile on her face. "Now that," she said, hugging Sophia tightly, "is how you graduate in style." The ceremony continued, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. Each subsequent graduate walked across the stage with a new energy, as if they too had been reminded that every achievement, every step forward, was worth celebrating. Later that evening, as the sun set on the day that had started with such anxiety, Sophia sat with her father in a quiet corner of the graduation party. "You didn't have to do that, Dad," she said softly. "You're right," he replied, his voice gentle. "I didn't have to. I wanted to. Because sometimes the world needs to be reminded that the real heroes aren't the ones on movie posters. They're the ones who fight their battles quietly, day after day, never asking for recognition, but earning it anyway." Sophia leaned her head on her father's shoulder, feeling, for the first time in a long while, completely at peace with who she was and where she came from. The whispers that had followed her for so long seemed to fade away, replaced by the quiet certainty that she had indeed earned her place, not despite her name, but alongside it. As the evening wore on, other graduates and their families stopped by to share their congratulations. But now, their words were different. They weren't talking about her famous father or her privileged life. They were talking about her determination, her hard work, her quiet strength. They were seeing her, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time. And in that moment, Sophia Mitchell realized that sometimes the greatest victories don't come with fanfare and spotlights. Sometimes they come in quiet moments of recognition, in the understanding that you are more than what others assume, in the knowledge that your struggles and triumphs are your own, regardless of your name or your background. Her father had given her more than just a famous name. He had given her the example of Rocky Balboa, not just the fighter in the ring, but the spirit that never gives up, that faces challenges head-on, that proves itself not through words but through actions. And today she had proven herself worthy of that legacy, not because of who her father was, but because of who she had chosen to be. The aftermath of graduation day rippled through social media like wildfire, but not in the way Sophia Mitchell had always feared. Instead of the usual celebrity gossip and speculation, people were sharing something different, stories of fathers and daughters, of hidden struggles behind privileged facades, of what it truly means to earn your place in the world. Emma Anderson, one of the social media coordinators for the university, sat at her desk the morning after graduation, sifting through countless posts and messages. "Have you seen this?" she called out to her colleague, William Phillips. "It's not just about Stallone showing up. People are talking about his daughter's GPA, her work ethic, the fact that she never used her name to get ahead." The narrative was shifting. But for Sophia, the real impact of yesterday's events was still sinking in. She sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes packed for her upcoming move, reading through messages from classmates she'd spent 4 years trying to prove herself to. "I never knew," wrote Charlotte Hall, a girl who had sat next to her, "in advanced economics. All those times you stayed late in the library, I thought you were just being dramatic. I should have seen how hard you were working." Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from James Green, the teaching assistant who had graded her papers with such scrutiny, always suspicious of preferential treatment. "Your father's speech made me realize something." His message read, "I spent so much time looking for evidence that you didn't deserve your grades. I almost missed seeing how much you'd earned them." A knock on her bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. Her father stood there, still in his casual clothes, looking more like Rocky than the Hollywood star the world knew him as. "Hey, kid," he said softly, "got a minute?" Sophia nodded, making space for him on the edge of her bed. He sat down, picking up one of her academic awards from the box beside him. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, When I wrote Rocky, everyone thought it was just about boxing, but it was never about the fights in the ring. He turned the award over in his hands, reading the inscription that recognized Sophia's excellence in business analytics. It was about the fights we face every day, the ones that don't have crowds cheering or cameras rolling, the ones where we're our only opponent. "Dad," Sophia started, but he held up a hand asking her to let him finish. "Yesterday, watching you on that stage, I saw something I've seen before. In the mirror, when I was writing that first script, when everyone said I was just another struggling actor who should know his place." He placed the award back in the box with careful reverence. "I saw someone who refused to let others define their worth." The morning sun streamed through her window, catching the tears that had begun to fall down Sophia's cheeks. "I just wanted to prove I could do it on my own," she whispered. "And that's exactly what you did," he replied, his voice firm with conviction. "But you know what I realized yesterday? Sometimes letting people see your struggle isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you can do." Outside, a group of journalists had gathered at the end of the driveway, hoping to catch a glimpse of the father-daughter moment that had captured the nation's attention. But inside this room, the story being shared was far more intimate than any headline could capture. "Your mother called this morning," her father continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She said her phone hasn't stopped ringing, but not from the usual entertainment reporters, from parents of kids who feel like they're living in someone else's shadow, fighting battles no one sees." Sophia stood up, walking to her window. From here, she could see the reporters, their cameras ready, their notepads poised. But for the first time in her life, their presence didn't fill her with dread. "Maybe," she said slowly, "that's the real story we should be telling." Her father joined her at the window, his reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. "What do you mean?" "All these years, I've been trying to hide who I am, trying to prove I'm more than just your daughter." She turned to face him, her expression determined. "But maybe being your daughter isn't something I need to prove myself despite. Maybe it's part of what made me strong enough to prove myself at all." The pride that filled her father's eyes was different from any movie premiere or award ceremony. This was the pride of a father seeing his daughter step into her own light, not running from her shadow, but learning to dance with it. A new message popped up on Sophia's phone from Isabella Nelson, the head of the university's Alumni Association. "We'd like you to speak at next year's orientation," the message read. "Not about being Sylvester Stallone's daughter, but about being a student who chose to earn her way, even when it would have been easier not to." Sophia showed the message to her father, watching as his expression shifted from pride to something deeper, understanding. "You see," he said softly, "sometimes our greatest challenge becomes our greatest gift to others." The morning turned to afternoon as father and daughter sat together, sharing stories they'd never told before. Sophia spoke about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, feeling the weight of expectations crushing her dreams. Her father shared his own struggles, not the ones written about in magazines, but the real ones, the fear that his success might become his children's burden, the worry that his name might be their cage instead of their wings. "You know what Rocky's really about?" he asked, as the sun began to set on this day of revelations. "It's about believing in yourself when no one else does. But sometimes," he smiled, looking at his daughter, "it's also about letting others believe in you when you're not sure you believe in yourself." As if on cue, another message appeared on Sophia's phone. This one was from William Turner, her first-year professor who had given her such a hard time. "I owe you an apology," it read. "I thought I was being fair by being hard on you, but I never considered how unfair it was to assume you needed the extra scrutiny. Your work spoke for itself. I just wasn't listening." The weight of his words hit her hard. All those times, she'd stayed up late, double and triple checking her work, knowing his eyes would be looking for any hint of preferential treatment. But now, in the light of her father's very public display of support, even those who had doubted her most were beginning to see the truth. "Dad," she said suddenly, "do you remember what you told me when I first started college? About how sometimes the hardest punch isn't the one that knocks you down, but the one you pull back from throwing?" He nodded, remembering the conversation well. It had been right after her first week of classes, when she'd come home in tears because someone had accused her of buying her way into the university. "I think I finally understand what you meant," she continued. "All this time I could have used your name, could have made things easier for myself. That was the punch I kept pulling back from throwing. But now I see that restraint, that choice to do things the hard way, that was my real strength." Her father stood up, walking to the shelf where her childhood photos sat next to his Oscar. "You know," he said, picking up a picture of her at her first piano recital, "everyone remembers the moment Rocky raises his arms at the top of those steps, but they forget about all the times he fell climbing them." Sophia joined him, looking at the photo. She remembered that day, how terrified she'd been, how she'd wanted to quit, how her father had told her about the time he'd been so nervous before an audition that he'd thrown up. "Yesterday wasn't just about me showing up at your graduation," he continued. "It was about showing the world that success isn't about who you are or where you come from. It's about the steps you take to get there, and the courage to keep taking them even when people are waiting for you to fall." As the day drew to a close, Sophia sat at her desk, opening her laptop. The cursor blinked on a blank document, waiting. After a moment's hesitation, she began to type. "Dear future students, you might know me as Sylvester Stallone's daughter, but that's not the only story I have to tell. Let me tell you about the nights in the library, the jobs between classes, the tears and the triumphs that no one saw." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pouring out the truth she'd kept hidden for so long, not just about the struggles, but about the strength she'd found in facing them, about the legacy she'd feared would define her, and how she'd learned to redefine it instead. Outside her window, the last of the reporters were packing up their cameras, heading home with their stories of Hollywood drama and celebrity moments. But inside, a different story was being written, one about a daughter who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of independence is accepting where you come from and using it to help others find their way. The morning sun cast long shadows across the university auditorium as Sophia Mitchell stood at the podium, facing a sea of nervous freshman faces. 3 months had passed since her graduation, and now she found herself back where it all began, but standing on the other side of the journey. "When I first sat where you're sitting now," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach, "I thought I knew exactly what my biggest challenge would be. I was Sylvester Stallone's daughter, and I was convinced that would be both my cross to bear and my mountain to climb." In the front row, Benjamin Hall, the new dean of students, nodded encouragingly. He had been the one to push for this speech, understanding that Sophia's story wasn't just about celebrity kids. It was about anyone who had ever felt the weight of expectations threatening to crush their dreams. "But I was wrong," Sophia continued, her eyes scanning the crowd. "My biggest challenge wasn't other people's assumptions about me. It was my own fear of never measuring up to what I thought I should be." The auditorium was silent. Hundreds of new students hanging on her every word. Among them sat Oliver Green, a freshman whose father was a renowned surgeon, and Emma Phillips, whose mother was a Supreme Court justice. Their eyes met Sophia's with a recognition that went beyond mere celebrity connection. "You see, we all come here carrying something," she said, stepping out from behind the podium. "Maybe it's a famous last name. Maybe it's the weight of being the first in your family to attend college. Maybe it's the pressure of living up to someone else's dreams, or the fear of disappointing those who sacrificed everything to get you here." In the back of the auditorium, Her father sat quietly, wearing a simple black sweater and jeans. No cameras, no reporters, just a father watching his daughter turn her struggles into strength for others. For 4 years, I tried to run from my name, Sophia continued. I worked 2 jobs, not because I needed the money, but because I needed to prove to myself more than anyone else that I could make it on my own. I spent countless nights in the library, double-checking every citation, triple-checking every calculation, terrified that someone would accuse me of getting special treatment. She paused, letting her words sink in. In the middle of the audience, Amelia Turner, a freshman with tears in her eyes, nodded slowly. Her father was the governor, and already she could feel the weight of that legacy settling on her shoulders. But here's what I learned. Sophia's voice grew stronger. Your legacy, whatever it may be, isn't a cage unless you make it one. It's not about running from who you are or where you come from. It's about choosing who you want to become. The morning. Light shifted, creating a warm glow in the auditorium. Sophia walked to the edge of the stage, making eye contact with as many students as she could. When my father showed up at my graduation dressed as Rocky, I was mortified at first. Here I was, trying so hard to be seen as my own person, and he was literally wearing the costume that made him famous. But then I realized something profound. She smiled, remembering that moment. Rocky wasn't just about boxing. It was about someone who refused to let others define their limits. And in that moment, my father wasn't just being Rocky. He was showing me that I had been Rocky all along, fighting my own fights, going the distance in my own way. In the audience, William Mitchell, a professor who had once been skeptical of Sophia's abilities, watched with a mixture of admiration and regret. He had been one of the hardest on her, convinced he was maintaining academic integrity. Now he saw that his scrutiny had been its own form of prejudice. Some of you might be sitting there thinking, easy for her to say, she's Stallone's daughter, Sophia acknowledged, her honesty drawing nervous laughter from the crowd. And you're right, I am Stallone's daughter, but I'm also the girl who worked the morning shift at the campus coffee shop. I'm the student who spent spring break doing extra credit research instead of partying in Cancun. I'm the graduate who earned her degree with honors, not because of my name, but despite it. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a worn piece of paper. This is something my father wrote to me when I first started college. I've never shared it with anyone before, but today feels right. Unfolding the paper carefully, she read, Dear Sophia, they're going to try to tell you who you are. They're going to think they know your story before you've even written it. But remember this, the real victory isn't in proving them wrong, it's in proving yourself right. Love, Dad. Looking up from the paper, she saw numerous students wiping away tears. In the 4th row, Lucas Nelson, a legacy admission whose grandfather's name was on one of the campus buildings, sat up straighter as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Your story, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, is valid, Sophia continued, but it's also incomplete. These next 4 years aren't about living up to someone else's expectations. They're about discovering your own. She walked back to the podium, but didn't step behind it. When I graduated, I thought I was finally free from the shadow of my father's success. But I've learned that sometimes what we think is a shadow is actually a spotlight. Not one that blinds us or exposes us, but one that helps us illuminate the path for others. In the audience, Charlotte Roberts, another freshman with a famous parent, was furiously taking notes. Later, she would tell her roommate that this was the first time she felt like someone truly understood her struggle. So, here's my challenge to you. Sophia's voice filled the auditorium with quiet authority. Don't try to be someone else's version of successful. Don't measure your worth by your name, your background, or others' expectations. Measure it by your effort, your integrity, and your willingness to keep going when giving up would be easier. She glanced at her father, who gave her a subtle nod. And remember this, the most important title you'll earn here isn't on your diploma. It's in becoming someone who knows their own worth, someone who understands that your name might open doors, but it's your work that makes you worthy of walking through them. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, obligatory kind. It was thunderous, genuine, filled with the energy of students who suddenly felt seen and understood. After the speech, as students filed out of the auditorium, many lingered to speak with Sophia. Olivia Clarke, whose mother was a famous actress, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "How did you do it?" she asked quietly. "How did you deal with the constant comparisons?" Sophia smiled, recognizing the familiar pain in the girl's eyes. "By realizing that comparisons are just another person's way of trying to write your story. But you're the only one who gets to decide how your chapters unfold." Throughout the morning, more students came forward with their own stories. James Anderson, struggling under the weight of his family's political dynasty. Emma Hall, trying to live up to her mother's groundbreaking scientific achievements. Each one carried their own version of the burden Sophia had learned to transform into strength. As the last student left, her father finally made his way to the stage. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've won awards, broken box office records, been celebrated all over the world. But watching you today, watching you turn your struggle into someone else's strength, that's the proudest I've ever been." Sophia hugged him tightly, no longer afraid that his presence would overshadow her achievements. "I learned from the best," she whispered. "You taught me that it's not about how hard you can hit, but about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward." Later that afternoon, as they walked across the campus together, students and faculty nodded in recognition. But their looks were different now, not the star-struck stares of celebrity watchers, but the respectful acknowledgement of someone who had earned their place. "Dad," Sophia said, stopping by the library where she had spent so many late nights. "Remember when you told me that sometimes the biggest fights aren't in the ring?" He nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I think I finally understand what you meant. The biggest fights are the ones we face in here." She tapped her heart. "The ones between who we think we should be and who we really are." As they stood there, the afternoon sun casting their shadows on the library steps, Sophia realized something profound. She had spent so long trying to step out of her father's shadow, only to discover that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is step into our own light and help others find theirs along the way. The conference room at the university's Career Center buzzed with nervous energy as Sophia Mitchell prepared for her first official mentoring session. What had started as a single orientation speech had evolved into something much bigger. A program specifically designed for students struggling with the weight of extraordinary expectations. Legacy Leaders, she'd named it, though the irony of the title wasn't lost on her. Around the large oak table sat 12 students, each carrying their own version of the burden she knew so well. Benjamin Anderson, son of a tech billionaire. Isabella Turner, daughter of a former president. Michael Roberts, whose family name graced hospitals across the country. "Before we begin," Sophia said, taking her seat at the head of the table, "I want to make something clear. This isn't about learning to cope with who you are. It's about discovering who you can become." The students exchanged glances, some nervous, others skeptical. In the corner, William Hall, the program's faculty advisor, watched with quiet interest. He had been one of the first to recognize the potential impact of what Sophia was creating. "Let's start with a simple exercise," she continued, pulling out a stack of blank papers. "I want each of you to write down your name, not your family. Name, not your full name, just the name you want to be known by, the name that feels most truly yours. Emma Green, whose mother was a celebrated humanitarian, spoke up first. But isn't that just running away from who we are? Isn't that what you said we shouldn't do? Sophia smiled, remembering how she had once asked similar questions. This isn't about running away, she explained. It's about understanding that your identity is more than just your connection to someone else's success. As the students began writing, Sophia shared a story she hadn't told at orientation. During my sophomore year, I had a professor, Alexander Phillips, who did something unexpected. He graded all assignments blind, with just student numbers, no names. When I got my first A+ in his class, it was the first time I knew, without any doubt, that I had earned it purely on merit. Charlotte Nelson looked up sharply. Did it change anything? How people saw you, I mean. No, Sophia admitted, but it changed how I saw myself, and sometimes that's where the real battle begins. The afternoon unfolded with more exercises and discussions. James Mitchell shared how he'd been rejected from 3 internships because companies assumed he was just another privileged kid looking for an easy ride. Olivia Baker described the pressure of being expected to follow her mother's footsteps into medicine when her passion lay in art. You know what my father told me recently, Sophia said, after listening to their stories. He said that when he wrote Rocky, everyone focused on the fighting, but the real story was about a man finding his worth in a world that had already decided who he was supposed to be. She stood up, walking to the whiteboard. Society loves to put us in boxes, she wrote as she spoke. The privileged kid, the celebrity offspring, the legacy admission. But here's what they don't tell you. These labels are just other people's way of trying to make sense of their own expectations. Lucas Carter raised his hand. But how do you deal with it when those expectations come from your own family? It was a question Sophia had wrestled with herself. By understanding that your parents' success is part of your story, but it's not your whole story. My father didn't become Rocky by following someone else's script. He wrote his own. The afternoon. Light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the conference room floor. Outside, campus life continued its normal rhythm, but inside this room, something transformative was taking place. I want each of you to share a dream, Sophia said. Something you've never told anyone because you were afraid it would disappoint people or seem inappropriate for someone of your background. One by one, the students opened up. Amelia Wright wanted to be a kindergarten teacher, despite her family's long line of corporate lawyers. Henry Clark dreamed of opening a small bookstore, even though his father ran one of the largest publishing houses in the country. Now here's the thing about dreams. Sophia leaned forward, her voice intense. They don't come with last names. They don't care about your family's expectations or society's assumptions. They're yours, and that makes them valid. She pulled out her phone, showing them a photo from her graduation day. When my father showed up dressed as Rocky, I thought he was drawing attention to our connection. But he was actually doing something much more powerful. He was reminding everyone, including me, that the greatest success stories aren't about living up to expectations. They're about defying them. The students gathered around to look at the photo, seeing it with new eyes. But wasn't he still trading on his fame? Emma Perez asked. Using his celebrity to make a point. He was using his most famous role to tell a different kind of story, Sophia explained. One about how success isn't inherited, it's earned every single day through choices and challenges and getting back up when life knocks you down. As the session continued, Sophia introduced another exercise. I want you to write a letter to yourself dated 5 years from now. But here's the catch. You can't mention your family name or connections. Write about who you want to be, not who you're expected to be. The room fell silent, except for the scratch of pens on paper. Some students wrote quickly, as if they'd been waiting for permission to express these thoughts. Others struggled, realizing how deeply they'd internalized others' expectations. "Your name," Sophia said as they wrote, "whether it's Stallone or Gates or Kennedy or completely unknown, is not a script. It's not a destiny. It's not even a promise. It's just a starting point. What you do with it, that's the real story." William. Hall watched from his corner, making notes. This program, he realized, wasn't just about helping privileged kids cope with their advantages. It was about something much more universal, the struggle to define oneself in a world that thinks it already knows who you are. As the session drew to a close, Sophia shared one final thought. "You know what the hardest part of my college journey was? It wasn't the late nights studying or the constant scrutiny. It was learning that being proud of where I came from didn't mean I had to be bound by it." She collected their letters, promising to mail them back in 5 years. Your heritage, your family name, your privileges, they're like tools in a workshop. They don't determine what you'll build, they just give you something to build with. The masterpiece is still yours to create. After the students left, William approached her. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when we first discussed this program, I thought it would be about helping them handle their advantages. But it's really about something else, isn't it?" Sophia nodded, gathering her materials. "It's about understanding that every advantage comes with its own set of challenges, and every challenge comes with its own opportunities for growth." Later that evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the day's notes, her phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Saw your program made the university newsletter," it read. "Proud of you, kid. You're not just stepping out of shadows anymore. You're helping others find their light." She smiled, thinking about how far she'd come from that nervous freshman who had been afraid to raise her hand in class, terrified of drawing attention to her name. Now she was using that very name to help others find their voice. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Isabella Turner, one of the students from the session. "I just wanted to say," she began hesitantly, "I've had people try to help me with this stuff before. Counselors, advisors, even life coaches. But today was different. Today was the first time I felt like someone really understood." Sophia gestured for her to sit down. "Want to know a secret?" she asked. "Understanding wasn't something I found. It was something I had to create. And now, that's what each of you has to do, too." As Isabella left, Sophia turned to look out her office window at the campus below. Students hurried between buildings, each carrying their own invisible burdens, their own dreams, their own battles between expectation and aspiration. She picked up one of the letters from the session, feeling the weight of unspoken dreams in its pages. Tomorrow, these students would go back to their lives, back to the weight of their names and the expectations they carried. But maybe, just maybe, they would carry something else too. The understanding that their story was theirs to write, their path theirs to choose, their success theirs to define. And in that moment, Sophia realized that maybe this was her real graduation, not the ceremony with the caps and gowns, not even her father's dramatic appearance, but this, the moment she understood that sometimes the greatest legacy we can leave is helping others find their own way to shine. The National Education Conference Hall was packed to capacity, but Sophia Mitchell felt strangely calm as she waited backstage. 6 months had passed since the launch of Legacy Leaders, and what had started as a small university program had grown into a movement that was catching the attention of educational institutions across the country. William Anderson, now the program's national coordinator, approached with a tablet displaying the latest statistics. 23 universities have adopted the program, he reported, his voice filled with quiet pride, and the preliminary results are remarkable. improved academic performance, decreased anxiety levels, higher engagement in extracurricular activities. Sophia nodded, but her mind was on the individual stories behind those numbers. She thought of Oliver Hall, who had finally found the courage to tell his banking dynasty family that he wanted to be a teacher. Of Emma Roberts, who had started a support group for students struggling with imposter syndrome. Of Michael Green, who had turned his experience with pressure into a peer counseling initiative. 5 minutes, called the stage manager, and Sophia took a deep breath. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of educators, administrators, and counselors from across the country, all gathered to learn about a program that had started with one simple realization. Sometimes, the heaviest burdens are the ones that look like privileges to everyone else. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights dimmed slightly, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the size of the audience. "When I was in college," she began, "I thought my story was unique. I was Sylvester Stallone's daughter, trying to prove herself in a world that had already decided who I was supposed to be. But what I've learned through legacy leaders is that my story is just one version of a struggle many students face." In the front row, Charlotte Turner, a guidance counselor from a prestigious prep school, leaned forward. She worked with students from some of the most prominent families in the country and had seen firsthand the pressure they faced. "We talk a lot about diversity in education," Sophia continued, "but we often overlook one particular form of diversity: the diversity of burden. Every student carries something. For some, it's financial hardship or social barriers. For others, it's the weight of extraordinary expectations or the fear of never measuring up to a famous name." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing a simple photograph of her father's rocky statue in Philadelphia. "This statue represents something interesting," she said. "To the world, it's a symbol of triumph, of making it big, of achieving the American dream. But to the children of success, it can feel like a mountain they're expected to climb every single day." The audience was silent, absorbing her words. In the middle section, Benjamin Phillips, dean of a prominent business school, was taking notes furiously. His institution had been struggling with how to support students from high-achieving families who were burning out under the pressure of legacy. "Legacy leaders isn't about teaching privileged kids to cope with their advantages," Sophia explained. "It's about helping all students understand that their worth isn't determined by their last name, whether that name opens doors or creates barriers." She shared stories from the program, careful to protect identities while conveying the universal themes. She told them about the student who had been afraid to apply for scholarships because people might think she was taking opportunities from those who really needed them. About the young man who had been accepted to every Ivy League school, but was paralyzed by the fear that he'd only gotten in because of his family's donations. "What we've discovered," she continued, "is that these students don't need more privileges or protection. They need what every student needs: the space to discover who they are beyond the expectations placed upon them." Isabella Mitchell, a student counselor from another university, raised her hand during the Q&A session. "How do you address the criticism that this program caters to the already privileged?" Sophia had been expecting this question. "By understanding that privilege itself can be a form of prison if we don't teach students how to handle it responsibly. These students will inherit influence, resources, and opportunities. Shouldn't we help them develop the emotional tools to use those advantages for positive change?" She clicked to another slide, showing the program's 3 core principles: identity, beyond legacy, purpose through privilege, and authentic achievement. "When we help these students find their authentic voice," she explained, "we're not just helping them. We're helping shape how the next generation of leaders will use their influence." James Nelson, a skeptical professor from the Midwest, spoke. "Up next, But isn't there something problematic about focusing resources on students who already have so many advantages? Sophia smiled, remembering her own similar concerns when first developing the program. We're not giving them more advantages, she clarified. We're teaching them how to turn their existing advantages into opportunities for others. Every student who goes through our program commits to mentoring others, to using their platform for positive change. She shared the story of Amelia Baker, a program participant who had used her family's business connections not to secure a cushy job for herself, but to create internship opportunities for first-generation college students. Of Lucas Young, who had leveraged his family's media influence to spotlight educational inequality. The real measure of our program's success, Sophia continued, isn't in how many privileged students we help cope with their advantages. It's in how many of them we help transform from being passive recipients of privilege to active agents of change. The afternoon session delved deeper into the practical aspects of implementing the program. Sophia shared the curriculum, the assessment, tools, the mentoring frameworks. But more importantly, she shared the philosophy that had emerged from her own journey. What we're really doing, she explained, is helping these students rewrite the narrative of privilege. Instead of seeing it as something to be ashamed of or defended, we're teaching them to see it as a responsibility, a tool for creating positive change. During the break, Henry Clark, an education researcher, approached her with data from his latest study. What you're doing, he said, showing her the numbers, is addressing a form of student stress that we've historically overlooked. The pressure of perceived privilege can be just as damaging as other forms of educational barriers. Sophia nodded, thinking of her own college days. The difference is these students often feel they don't have the right to acknowledge their struggles. They're told they should be grateful, that their problems aren't real problems. As the conference drew to a close, Sophia shared one final story, her father's graduation appearance, but this time she told it differently. When my father showed up dressed as Rocky, she said, he wasn't just making a statement about my journey. He was demonstrating something fundamental about success, that it's not about living up to an image, but about finding the courage to be authentically yourself. The applause that followed was thoughtful, measured, the response of educators who had found a new perspective on an old challenge. As people filed out, many stopped to share their own stories of students struggling under the weight of legacy. Later that evening in her hotel room, Sophia received a message from William Anderson. The first international inquiries about the program had started coming in. Schools from London, Tokyo, Dubai, all facing the same challenge of helping students find their identity beyond their inheritance. She sat down at her laptop, opening the file containing the letters her first group of students had written to their future selves. In a few months, it would be time to mail them. She wondered how many of those students had already begun to see themselves differently, to understand that their legacy wasn't a script they had to follow, but a foundation they could build upon. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Saw the live stream of your speech. You didn't just step out of my shadow. You're helping others find their light. That's what real strength is about. Sophia smiled, remembering how far she'd come. From the girl who had once been afraid to raise her hand in class. She opened a new document and began typing, "Dear future legacy leaders." Because sometimes, she had learned, the most powerful way to help others find their way is to keep sharing your own story of how you found yours, not as a blueprint to follow, but as proof that it's possible to write your own script, even when the world thinks it already knows your story. 1 year to the day after her graduation, Sophia Mitchell stood in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, facing the famous steps her father had immortalized decades ago. The evening gala, celebrating the first anniversary of Legacy Leaders, was in full swing inside, but she needed this moment alone, looking out at the city where both Rocky's story and her own had found their meaning. Alexander Green, one of her original mentees who had now become a program coordinator, found her there. "Everyone's waiting," he said softly. "They're ready for the big reveal." Sophia nodded, taking one last look at the steps. Today wasn't just about celebrating the program's success. It was about unveiling its next phase, one that would transform their work from an educational initiative into a nationwide movement. Inside, the grand hall was filled with faces that told the story of the program's impact. Emma Hall, once paralyzed by her family's expectations, now confidently led her own student advocacy group. William Turner, the professor who had once doubted her, had become one of the program's strongest advocates. And there, in the front row, sat her father, not as Rocky, not as a movie star, but as a parent who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is the space to find their own way. "A year ago," Sophia began as she took the podium, "I stood on a graduation stage, terrified that my father's appearance would overshadow everything I'd worked for. Today, I understand that moment differently. It wasn't about shadow or spotlight. It was about the courage to be authentically ourselves, even when the world thinks it already knows our story." The room was silent, hundreds of educators, students, and parents hanging on her words. Among them sat Benjamin Roberts, whose technology empire had funded their latest expansion, and Isabella Phillips, whose foundation had helped create scholarships for students from all backgrounds to access their programs. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating what Legacy Leaders has achieved," Sophia continued. "We're launching something new. Something that takes everything we've learned about identity, privilege, and purpose and transforms it into action." She gestured to the large screen behind her, where images began to play. Students from their program working in communities, creating opportunities, using their influence for positive change. "We call it Legacy Forward, because the true measure of privilege isn't in what you inherit, but in what you choose to do with it." Charlotte Anderson, head of their research division, stepped forward to share the data. Over the past year, program participants had created more than 200 community initiatives, established 50 mentorship programs in underfunded schools, and launched dozens of social impact projects. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," Sophia resumed. "The real story is in the lives changed, the perspectives shifted, the barriers broken down. It's in students like Michael Nelson, who used his family's real estate connections not to secure his own future, but to create affordable housing initiatives for college students in need." She shared more stories of Olivia Mitchell, who had transformed her struggle with anxiety into a mental health awareness campaign, of James Carter, who had leveraged his family's political connections to advocate for educational equity, of Emma Wright, who had turned her experience with imposter syndrome into a support network for first-generation college students. "What we've discovered," Sophia explained, "is that the weight of expectation can either crush you or become the foundation upon which you build something meaningful. The choice lies not in what you're given, but in what you choose to give back." Her father stood up then, not as part of the program, but as someone who had his own story to share. "When I wrote Rocky," he began, his voice carrying across the hall, "I was writing about an underdog fighting for his chance. What I never expected was that my own daughter would show me a different kind of fight, the fight to be yourself when the world wants to make you something else." Sophia felt tears welling up as he continued. But she didn't just win that fight for herself. She created a way for others to win it too. And maybe that's the real Rocky story. Not just about getting up when life knocks you down, but about helping others find their feet too. The lights dimmed, and a new video began playing. interviews with students from across the country, each sharing how the program had helped them transform their relationship with their legacy. Lucas Hall, speaking about finally embracing his passion for teaching despite his family's banking dynasty. Amelia Perez, describing how she'd learned to use her family's media influence to spotlight underrepresented voices. Legacy Forward isn't just a program, Sophia explained as the video ended. It's a movement, a commitment to turning privilege into purpose, influence into impact, and inheritance into inspiration. She unveiled the initiative's 3 pillars. Community impact projects, requiring each participant to create or support a social initiative. Mentorship chains, where students who receive support must become mentors themselves. And legacy scholarships, funded by program participants to support students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Because here's what we've learned, she continued, the opposite of privilege isn't disadvantage, it's responsibility. And when we teach students to embrace that responsibility, something remarkable happens. The very things that once felt like burdens become tools for positive change. William Baker, Dean of Student Affairs at another participating university, shared how the program had transformed their campus culture. We're seeing students who once hid their family connections, now openly discussing how to use those connections for community benefit. The shame has been replaced by purpose. As the evening progressed, Sophia revealed the final component of their new initiative, a documentary series following students as they navigate their journeys from privilege to purpose. Because these stories need to be told, she explained, not as tales of advantage, but as examples of how personal struggle can become collective progress. Near the end of the event, Isabella Turner, one of their first students, now a program mentor herself, took the stage. A year ago, I was sitting in that first Legacy Leaders session, thinking no one could understand what it was like to carry the weight of a famous name. Today, I understand that the weight doesn't have to be a burden. It can be a foundation for building something meaningful. As the gala drew to a close, Sophia found herself back at the museum steps, this time with her father beside her. "You know what I see when I look at these steps now?" she asked him. "What's that, kid?" "I see all the different ways people climb them. Some run, some walk, some struggle with every step. But the victory isn't just in reaching the top, it's in what you do when you get there." Her father smiled. "Understanding. And what are you going to do up there? Help others find their way up," she replied. Because maybe that's what legacy really means. Not just leaving something behind, but lifting others up along the way. The next morning, as news of the Legacy Forward initiative spread across social media and educational networks, Sophia sat in her office reading through the latest applications to their program. Each story was different, but the theme was the same. Young people looking to transform their inheritance from a burden into a blessing, from privilege into purpose. She opened her laptop to write the introduction for their new handbook. Your name, your background, your privileges, these aren't just things you carry. They're tools you can use to build something larger than yourself. The question isn't whether you deserve what you've been given. The question is, what will you give back? Because in the end, the greatest legacy isn't the one you inherit. It's the one you choose to create. And sometimes, the most powerful way to honor your past is to use it to build a better future for others. Welcome to Legacy Forward. Your story begins here. As she finished writing, a notification popped up on her screen. The first Legacy Leaders letters, written by students to their future selves a year ago, were ready to be mailed. Sophia smiled, knowing that when those students read their letters, they would see how far they'd come. Not just in what they'd achieved, but in how they saw themselves and their place in the world. Because sometimes the greatest achievement isn't in proving yourself to others, but in discovering who you were meant to be all along. And sometimes, the most powerful legacy isn't the one you're born into, but the one you choose to build, step by step, Day by day, one changed life at a time.